Hello, everybody. I'm Vladimir Pechatnov from Moscow State Institute of International Relations here in Moscow, and I'm very glad to be able to address this distinguished conference on such a timely subject. I'm glad to pick up this theme of Kennedy American University speech, because I've been always admiring it as a rare combination of bold political wisdom and powerful eloquence. Let me touch upon two aspects of this subject. First, talk about the historical context and significance of the speech, and then about its relevance for today. Kennedy's speech was not an isolated event. It was part and parcel of American diplomacy in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis, as we know, had a sobering impact on both sides. Retreating from the brink, Kennedy and Khrushchev were ready to reassess their old policies and assumptions. But Khrushchev was in a more precarious position. He was vulnerable to internal and external, especially Chinese, criticism for backing down during the crisis. So he was more restrained in moving toward accommodation, while Kennedy gained in prestige and self-confidence as a result of the crisis. The astute American diplomacy was fully aware of Khrushchev's predicament. They saw the Soviet leader standing at the crossroads. One way was to start a crash new program of strategic build-up in order to redress the imbalance which was so dramatically revealed during the crisis. And the second option was to stabilize the relationship, to reduce tensions, to make the nuclear arms race less dangerous, and to resolve some thorny issues in East-West relations. So the Kennedy team saw its task in pushing Khrushchev gently toward that second option. The State Department people called it Golden Bridge strategy. That is, providing Khrushchev with a golden bridge for retreat from confrontation, intimidation to accommodation. As State Secretary Rusk said to his counterpart, the British ambassador in Washington, in mid-November of '62, we should not push the Soviets into a corner, and we shouldn't rub Khrushchev's nose. So to facilitate that Soviet movement in that desired direction, American diplomacy was working over specific proposals like civil aviation agreement, joint space ventures, speeding up nuclear test ban negotiations, and other specific proposals. But there was also a need perceived in Washington for a more dramatic public action, which would demonstrate America's readiness to meet Moscow halfway on the way to rapprochement. Hence, the idea of American University speech came in handy. As we now know, the president planned it for some time. Then he had an advice from his entourage and some people outside of it, like normal cousins. And finally, the speech was compiled by best pens of the Kennedy administration. It had a powerful impact in Moscow, both in its tone and substance. By proposing in his speech a unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing in the atmosphere, Kennedy indicated that it was not just words and idealism that he was pushing forward in that speech, but some substance as well. Khrushchev was very glad to have this speech. He advertised it widely in the Soviet press. It was published in full by Soviet newspapers. And as Khrushchev later told Ambassador Harriman, it was the speech, it was American University speech, which paved the way for test ban treaty. That's how the mini-détente of 1963 came about. test ban treaty, the first grain sale deal, hotline between Moscow and Washington, the first talks on nuclear non-proliferation. There were even more far-reaching proposals on the shelf on the American side. As Kennedy's very assuring Ambassador Dobrynin, and he reported it to Moscow, the White House was ready to continue detente after 1964 elections. And those were not just words. In the Kennedy archive, I saw documents, the blueprints for the second term, with such proposals as curbing the arms race, reducing military budget, and even economic reconversion from the first term administration. So we can only speculate what would have happened had both men, Khrushchev and Kennedy, lasted longer in their posts. In which case the Kennedy administration, the American University speech would be just the beginning of this long road to real detente. But even without that, it remains one of the landmarks, I think, in Soviet-American relations, even today. What about its relevance? Let me briefly mention just several enduring themes coming out from that speech, which I think are important today. The first one is the one of self-re-examination, soul-searching, if you wish, an ability to, and Kennedy's call to re-examine Americans' attitude toward the Soviet Union, toward the Cold War, and the nuclear arms race. It takes a courage, especially in democracy, to challenge the old conventional prevailing majority views, especially after the Cuban crisis, when, of course, the American public was rather hostile to the Soviet Union. But Kennedy had that courage. He understood that in order to end the Cold War, America too had to change its ways. So he was calling on his countrymen to re-examine their attitude toward the Soviet Union and toward the Cold War itself. Second, Kennedy was the first American president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II to acknowledge Russia as a great power and to express real empathy for Russia's enormous losses in World War II, in one of the most moving parts of his speech. In doing so, he clearly recognized that Americans' views of the Soviet Union had to change, had to be changed for the Cold War to recede into the past. Third theme is Kennedy's call for making the world safe for diversity. Famous reversal of Woodrow Wilson's call to making the world safe for democracy. Kennedy realized, envisioned the world in which each country, each nation would be free to choose their own system, and in which there will be no imposition of a single model, be it Soviet or American one, because, as Kennedy said in this speech, no system, no model has a monopoly on wisdom. Where is this tolerance toward diversity now, when, especially in the West, we have this democratic triumphalism, this crusade to expand the Western model on American democracy toward the rest of the world? Finally, Kennedy's sense of history, which allowed him to see the Cold War as a transitionary phase in East-West relations, which would pass, which would end someday, if only because, as he said, enmity between nations, as between individuals, cannot last forever. And Cold War, as we know, has ended, but its residue and its legacy is still with us. To overcome those, it would take joint efforts from both sides, and among other things, we need that public leadership, that public education of which this speech was such a fine example of. And we need that on both sides. So let's rediscover that great speech again and act in the spirit of what Kennedy said here 50 years ago. Thank you, and have a good conference.